So over the holiday break, I read the book Vue.js Up and Running by Callum McRae, and one of the features that really caught my eye in Vue.js was the ability to add these event modifiers to the template binding for DOM events. So for example, here I have a .once, which would bind the click event and then implicitly unbind it after the first invocation. Things like .self, which will only fire if the click target is the same as the host element on which the event is bound. So for example, if I click directly on the A, this would fire. But if I clicked on the code element here, it would not fire, as the target would not be the same as the anchor tag. Then we have things like .stop and .prevent, which call stop propagation and prevent default respectively. And here's one for .passive, which binds a passive event handler, which is supported in some browsers. Now, because Angular's DOM event system is built on top of a plugin architecture, we can actually build these Vue.js type event modifiers directly into the Angular template binding system. Now, I've looked at this a number of times before, so this isn't really anything new. This is just sort of a fun exploration and some opportunity for cross-pollination of ideas. So let's take a quick look in the browser just to see how this behaves. But what you'll notice first, right, so I have an unordered list here, and at the list level, I'm actually binding two different click handlers, one in the capture phase, which is one of our event modifiers, and then one in the bubbling phase, which is the default phase of the event lifecycle. So essentially, we're going to catch events going into and bubbling back out of the list, and then we're also going to log those clicks at the anchors as well. So let's jump in and take a look. So here, let me just refresh, make sure I have the right code. So here, once, you can see that we log in the capture phase and then the bubbling phase of the list event, and then we also get the one local event. Now if I click once again, what you'll see is that we get again the two parent events here, but we don't get that intermediary local event, and that's because the event handling was unbound after it was clicked the first time. So none of the subsequent clicks will actually trigger the local log. Now we have something like self, so if I click on the code element, you'll see that we get no local log, right? But if I click on the anchor element directly, you'll see here we get that local log. We can combine things, so here we have once and self. So if I click again in the code element, we don't get anything because it doesn't pass the .self. But if we click here on the anchor, you'll see that we do get the .once.self. Now because it was using .once, means that the second click here won't include any local link. It'll just include the two parent links for the capture and bubbling phase of the event lifecycle. Stop here stops the propagation. So what you'll see is that we get the parent capture on the parent log on the capturing phase. We get the local log, but then because it calls stop, we don't get the event bubbling back up during the bubbling event phase. For prevent, if I mouse over here, you can see that this, prevent, you can see this actually links down to Google, right, if we look down here. But by clicking prevent, you'll see that I am preventing the default behavior of the event and therefore not allowing it to navigate to Google. Now, if I do once self prevent, because again we can chain all these things together, it's also going to point to Google. But let's start by clicking on the code tag. If we click on the code tag, you'll see it navigates because that wasn't a .self, it wasn't a direct link. Now if we click on the anchor itself, you'll see that again the link points to Google, but the .prevent prevented the default behavior, which prevented the link from being navigated. However, we also have the .once, which means that this event handler should have just unbound itself. So if I click on the anchor element again, you'll see that this time it does in fact navigate to Google. And finally here you can see that we have a passive event handler opportunity, and if I click that, you'll see that we get a warning here because I'm attempting to prevent the default behavior inside of a passive event handler, which Chrome tells you that it can't do, because the whole point of the passive event handler is that it can't prevent the default behavior, which allows the browser to execute things a little bit more efficiently. Groovy. So let's take a look at how this works. And again, I've looked at event plugins before, so there's nothing terribly new here. But essentially, what we need to do is provide a plugin in our app module, which allows us to detect and then bind for the various event handlers. So if we jump down to the supports, where is it? To the supports method, Angular is going to pass in the particular event binding, so it might be click.self in this case. And what we're looking for here is any event name that matches a standard event name followed by one or more, right, the plus sign here, one or more of these event modifiers, stop, prevent, capture, self, once passive. In Vue.js, the order that we provide these in actually matters, but in my case it doesn't matter. All these do is flip a flag on an underlying configuration object, which is then used to drive the logic for the event binding. So if we do support it, Angular's event manager will then turn around and call our add event listener. Here we're taking that higher order event name and we're parsing it into a configuration object. So let's just take a look and see what that does. So here you can see I'm splitting the event name on the plus, giving us all the parts like click, self, prevent, stop, once, etc. Setting up my config object, everything here defaults to false. And then essentially what I do is just while I have any elements left in that parts array, I am shifting them off the front and then checking the value and flipping the various flags to true. So if we have stop, you can see I flip is stop. If I have prevent, I flip is prevent, so on and so forth. And then I return this. This config that then gets passed to this setup event binding, which you'll see here, just takes that event config object and uses it to drive some logic in the event binding. Let's skip over the stuff at the top because that's just a little bit more complicated. But what you'll see is that inside my proxy function here, I can check to see what the value of various config flags are and then determine how I want to manage the event handling. So for example, if it's self and the target does not equal the event target, then I'm just going to return out of this event handler because we only want to trigger it for self. If it's a once event modifier, then I go ahead and remove the actual function binding before I turn around and call the underlying handler. And then for stop and prevent, I'm calling stop, propagation, and prevent default, respectively. And that's really all there is to it. You'll see that I'm not dealing with any of the ng zone stuff. I'm just letting the change digest happen since there's pretty much a one-to-one mapping, with the exception of self here for the event bindings and the change detection. And again, just as a reminder here, in my app module, we get the event manager's plugin, and then we add our Vue Event-Modifiers plugin as part of that multi-collection. And that's that plugin architecture that Angular uses to manage the DOM bindings in our Angular component templates and our directive host bindings. And anyway, super flexible. And I mean, again, I've looked at all of these event manager plugins before, and it just never gets old, right? The fact that we can do all this stuff is just a testament to how flexible Angular is and how unopinionated it is about many things, right? Angular has this bad rap about being massively opinionated, but it really isn't. It really is super flexible and gives us opportunity to do things in all kinds of different ways, to augment the runtime capabilities in all kinds of ways, to use different types of bindings and different types of template definitions, whether you're defining templates in the component, whether you're defining them as external files, same with styles. It's actually super flexible. And it's just another reason why Angular never gets old. It's really exciting to work with.